Yeah.
I think we're good.
Where is
It
it?
has to be in the corner, so.
Oh, I see. Okay.
What is there on the second? We're gonna be talking agriculture and human health, and also really kind of talking about this whole planetary boundary concept, and then looking at nitrogen as a case study. And I think this whole topic and the use of planetary boundaries and thinking about nitrogen and what we're going to talk about today is just, it's really interesting because the idea here is that we're kind of integrating both environment, human activity, the environment, impacts on the environment itself, and also impacts on human health. And it's, we often hear and we often say in this kind of work, we're all connected, but I think this is a really good example of that. And I think could be also really interesting to your students here, given how big agricultural is in our county and the impacts it has on our county, the ocean, and our health. And at the same time, of course, agriculture is very important. I mean, in Salinas Valley, we grow a lot of the foods that we know are actually associated with, better health, better well-being, fruits and vegetables. So I'll get started. If anyone wants to interrupt and ask a question, don't wait till the end, please speak up. So I think everyone knows me. If there's anyone who's new here, I'm Asa Bradman. I've been involved here for a while. I think maybe you're the only first person there.
And I'm the makerspace coordinator, Alyssa Lund. If you guys need anything at all in the space or you're curious about any supplies, I'm happy to help with that.
Way to go. This place is awesome.
Yeah. So just a little outline and some of the things we'll cover today. The idea here is to examine planetary boundaries and, thinking about ecosystem level impacts, but also how that drills down to the individual and the risks and health impacts on individual people or populations. I mentioned we'll focus on nitrogen and impacts at the planetary level and at the individual level, and then introduce some solutions. There are some innovative laws and activities going on in the ag sector here to try to address nitrogen pollution. So,
Lisa, I just want to be clear about the word boundary, because that word is, I think, is used very differently in the environmental principles and concepts, which are our California environmental literacy standards. So in those standards, the boundary means that there isn't one between systems, but you're talking about the limits for our whole planet. Is that right? Okay,
right.
I just want to.
Okay, well, that's interesting.
Parse that a
Yeah.
little.
So this idea of planetary boundaries and planetary boundary maps was developed in 2009 by the Stockholm Resilience Center. And I think it's a really innovative idea because it provides a way of thinking about the Earth and kind of our ecosystem services that the Earth provides to ameliorate impacts. And then whether at some point we exceed the capacity of the Earth to absorb human-related impacts. And they came up originally with 9 categories, and we'll go over those in a second. And then they, I think, came up with a really innovative way to present this graphically, and we'll go into that a little more detail in a moment. So the idea for a planetary boundary, so yeah, this is about capacity of the Earth. The idea is that for each boundary, there's kind of a threshold. Below that threshold, we have a functioning ecosystem, we have a functioning environment, and above that threshold, we're kind of risking change that can have potentially irreversible impacts on the Earth. I mean, a good example right now is with carbon dioxide, which we're all familiar with. Right now, I think we're around 400 or 410 parts per million. It's been creeping up. I think 50 years ago, it was 350. And, we've talked about in terms of climate change that we don't want the Earth to get beyond about a 1.5 degrees Celsius change, an increase, and that's about the limit where we are with carbon dioxide. We may already be pushing on this limit. Then there's the idea that if we exceed it, again, we kind of enter a red zone. So therefore, we're exceeding the capacity, and then there's a potential for real change that's gonna be permanent, or at least ongoing. I think we're experiencing that right now. And there's some boundaries like nitrogen excess or biogeochemical flows, which we'll talk about in a bit, that have already crossed boundaries. In fact, several have. So these are the categories that you saw earlier. There's 9 kind of general groups that they conceived of in this model, and we'll be talking more about these at the end. But notice that in red, biogeochemical flows, i.e. nitrogen and phosphorus, and novel entities, which is the refers to chemicals and plastics and microplastics, things like that, which we talked about a couple of years ago, are really perceived to be exceeding the current planetary boundaries. And microplastic, of course, some people are talking about this age as the Plasticine age. Another topic. So again, if we look at these pictures, I hope everyone can see it. We kind of have the Earth here as a sphere, and below these, the dotted line, these boundaries, we're kind of still within the capacity of the Earth to address and ameliorate a problem. For example, we put carbon dioxide in the air. Well, if 1,000 years ago, if you burn some coal, it's not going to have a big impact. Now, of course, if you have hundreds or thousands of coal burning power plants, we're exceeding the ability of the planet to absorb carbon dioxide. So the idea here is if we go beyond the boundary of the Earth, we've kind of identified a system or a stress that's exceeding the capacity of the Earth to ameliorate it. And again, some of the ones that in 2009, when they developed this, they identified 3 categories: biogeochemical flows, biosphere integrity, i.e. extinction, and climate changes were already pushing the boundary or exceeding it. In 2015, we're up to 4 categories. They added land systems. When we think of land systems, think of deforestation in the rainforest or desertification. So we're talking about changes to our ecosystems and biomes that are potentially permanent. And here we are in 2023, and they're estimating now 7 systems are exceeding the capacity of the Earth. We added land systems, but also freshwater use, of course, a big issue in California. And then the novel entities is this category of chemicals and plastics and things like that. Agriculture this year, which we're focusing on for our projects this year, is pushing the Earth beyond capacity on several boundaries. And that's why, agriculture is so important. A huge percentage of land on Earth is devoted to agriculture, and it's contributing to the categories that have fully transgressed the boundaries: nitrogen, phosphorus, biosphere integrity. We're cutting down lots of rainforests to grow soybeans, for example, in Brazil, and then feed cattle to export to the US. And then it's also pushing land system change. Clearly, we're clearing land for agriculture, using lots of water, big issue in California, especially things like almond trees is a big issue in the Central Valley. We've probably heard a lot about alfalfa and the amount of water that goes into alfalfa. We're actually using fossil water in Arizona to grow alfalfa that's getting exported to Saudi Arabia. So we're essentially exporting our fossil water around the world. As a result, we're depleting our resources. And then, of course, climate change, which we've talked about a bit. So we want to zero in as kind of a case study on one of these that's very relevant to agriculture and our region. I mean, just driving across the Salinas River on the way here, a lot of that nitrogen that we're using to grow plants is flowing out to that river. In fact, only about 50% of the nitrogen that's applied to a given field actually goes into providing nutrients to the plants.
What
So
percentage? I'm sorry.
about 50%.
Yeah.
So if we look right now, the group that evaluated this at the Stockholm Resilience Center identified about 62 teragrams. We should probably change that into tons. But anyway, teragrams is a lot of weight. And we're currently using about 150 teragrams per year. So we're almost using 3 times the amount of nitrogen that, in their evaluation, the Earth is able to handle. And, when we think about it locally, there's a lot of circumstances where we can see how, again, it's impacting the environment and our health. So just to reiterate, what we said earlier, agricultural use of nitrogen is a major driver of the limits of the Earth, specifically in biogeochemical flows, and it's damaging to our ecosystems and can be directly toxic to ourselves. So if you think back on all the things we've talked about in terms of toxicity, risk assessment, nitrogen actually plays in a lot of different roles there. And it's one of these interesting things because it's actually essential for life. Nitrogen is part of proteins. It's an essential plant nutrient, but it also can be bad for us in many different ways. So this is from Wikipedia, publicly available. Nitrogen flows, it's kind of a graphic of the nitrogen cycle. Maybe there's better ones, but the point is that we have lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere. N2, in fact, 80% of the air we're breathing right now is nitrogen. But it's bound as N2 and it's basically inert. And then there's a number of processes that convert that into available ions for plant use and other biological use. And that can involve lightning actually breaks apart a certain amount of nitrogen and creates nitrogen available for plants. And then there's a number of, probably should have added a slide here, but there's a number of biological processes with bacteria and legumes. There's some fungi as well, some algae in water that can actually react with the atmospheric nitrogen and convert it into available forms for life, like nitrates and ammonia. And what we don't have a slide here, and we'll add one, is the Haber-Bosch process. The Haber-Bosch process was developed in the early 1900s, and it basically uses natural gas and the energy from that to convert nitrogen in the air to synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. So all of this kind of pure, unbiological, just basically salts of nitrogen are formed by the Haber-Bosch process.
Which is 68 million tons per your request.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So 68 million tons.
That's the green revolution, right?
Exactly, yeah. So this kind of ties in with, we talked about biogeochemical flows and nitrogen, phosphorus, all kinds of nutrients are flowing through the land. And I wonder, this is kind of an important point here when I talked about biogeochemical cycling. There's about 92 naturally occurring elements. We look at the, our table of elements, and about 40 are essential to living organisms. So they're really the nutrients. And some of the key ones, the macronutrients, are things like nitrogen and phosphorus. So back in the day, before, agricultural, I should say not before, but as agricultural science was really developing, this fellow, Javon Liebig, came up with the idea of what became known as the law of the minimum. And this is a really important concept in agriculture. The idea is that the rate of growth of a plant, the size to which it grows, and its overall health depend on the amount of the scarcest essential nutrient that are available to it. So it kind of makes sense. And it's often, this graphic is used all over the internet. I've seen it in many different places. But the idea here is if you have, your soil and you have different nutrients, and if there's one that's low, that's going to create the limit on how full the barrel can get. It's also going to place the limit on how healthy or the degree to which a given plant will reach its maximum productivity. So if anything is low, again, we have a limit there, and often it's nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, NPK, the 3 big nutrients for plant health that are low. And similarly, when we look at biogeochemical flows, often it's that cycling of nutrients that determines what a given ecosystem will look like. So if you have a nitrogen limited environment, that will regulate how much plankton or algae can grow in a river or a pond, or how much biomass will form in a forest. So what we've done with agriculture is that we've, identified this synthetic source of nitrogen. We can pull tons of it out of the atmosphere and then apply it to our fields. And nitrogen is often the limiting nutrient. And it has substantial impacts on, again, our environment and health. And just a quick summary here, we're about to go into more detail. Ocean dead zones, which is kind of a form of eutrophication. We'll mention that in a bit. Harmful algal blooms, increased air pollution, acute toxicity to humans, and even cancer risk. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail. The idea behind ocean dead zones is many of you have heard about, the idea of eutrophication, which is essentially the process that's going on here when you have nutrient runoff from agriculture, usually from agriculture. It could be other land use and landscaping and things like that. But you can imagine, we're throwing all this nitrogen into our cornfields, in soybean fields in the middle of the country, place like the Salinas Valley. We're throwing a lot of nitrogen onto lettuce fields, broccoli fields, strawberries, and some of it's going to get washed out to the ocean. And often when we go out into the ocean, nutrients, especially nitrogen and to some extent phosphorus, are limiting nutrients from that biome. So when we throw in those nutrients, we get blooms of algae and microorganisms. And then there eventually are so many that they die. And when they die, then we have all this decomposing material. And of course, when they die, they're respiring. So they're consuming oxygen to decompose, and they're pulling oxygen out of the water. So we get what we call hypoxic regions. And these hypoxic regions can become dead zones in the ocean environment. And it's been especially acute in areas on the Gulf of Mexico, but they also have occurred in areas along the West Coast, including our region, Sacramento River, going up to Puget Sound and other locations. It's more substantial in the Gulf, where we have, huge the Mississippi River and huge, vast drainage area where there's very intensive agriculture. But when you take out the oxygen in the air, animals that can flee will flee. So you'll drive out fish and things like that. And animals that can't flee may be killed. Definitely a substantial ecosystem level impact. Now kind of looking more at kind of the transition between environmental impacts and humans, another impact of nutrient runoff, nitrogen in particular, is blooms of algae. So here we're not talking directly about eutrophication. So we're not talking about necessarily enough to deplete oxygen in a given surface water, but when you have the right combination of nutrients, salinity, and temperature, certain breeds of algae, blue-green algae, others can bloom, and some of them form extremely toxic toxins. If you remember, we talked about toxicants and toxins. Toxicants are chemicals produced by people, like pesticides that make you sick. Well, a toxin is something produced by a living thing that can make you sick. Botulism is kind of the botulin toxin is one of the most well-known, but also, again, some of the toxins produced by these algae are extremely toxic. And we can be exposed to them by eating contaminated fish or other seafood, recreation in water. More and more, a couple of years ago, they shut down the Merced River for many miles because of elevated harmful algal blooms. And there's growing evidence too that living near some waters, actually the toxins can get into the air and be aerosolized and impact respiratory health and things like that. In the harbor in Stockton, you go there and you can see they actually have little lines underwater where they bubble oxygen into the water to try to change the balance of algae in the water and reduce harmful algal formation. And this, I've talked a little bit with folks in the State Water Quality Resources Board, and if any of your students want to get a PhD in this, there's a lot of interesting work to do. It's really a growing field, and the state and other agencies need people to work on this stuff. So some of the health impacts are gastrointestinal illness. You've probably heard stories of dogs drinking water from ponds and dying. Asthma, liver damage, and there's even some evidence for neurological damage. And certainly for things like domoic acid and other algal toxins that build up in like our Dungeness crabs off the coast can cause serious neurological damage. And there's evidence that with changing climate that even we don't think of it quite as a bloom, but populations of toxin producing algae are increasing off our coast. And that's why our Dungeness crab season is getting shorter. So I want to see if we can maybe play this video. It's 3 minutes. I might need to see if this works. And
Oh, it does.
will we get the sound?
That is a good question. I don't know. Looks like there's sound.
Its many beautiful lakes, rivers, and streams, summer in California provides all kinds of opportunities for water recreation. And while the warm water and abundant sunshine can make for the perfect summer day on the water, they're also the perfect conditions for something that its many beautiful lakes, rivers, and streams, summer in California provides all kinds of opportunities for water recreation. And while the warm water and abundant sunshine can make for the perfect summer day on the water, they're also the perfect conditions for something that can ruin your day. Harmful algal blooms, or HABs. Cyanobacteria, also known as blue-green algae, are naturally occurring components of ecosystems that can grow rapidly in warm, calm waterways. Under these conditions, they can quickly grow into large blooms, which can be seen in the water and along the shoreline. And while some of them are harmless, others release toxins into the water which can harm both people and pets. And there's no way to tell if they're harmful just by looking at them. Characteristics of a potentially harmful algal bloom include small green, blue-green, white, or brown particles in the water, color streaks in the water, and mats, scum, or foam on the surface or the shoreline. Avoid getting into the water when you see signs of blue-green algae and look for posted advisories related to HABs. Under a caution advisory, swimming is allowed, but it's recommended to avoid contact with the algae. Under a warning or danger advisory, do not swim or let your pet swim. Under any posted advisories, it's important to know that contact with HABs can be very harmful to people, causing rashes, vomiting, diarrhea, or other cold and flu-like symptoms. Animals can be especially susceptible to the toxins because they tend to drink while in the water and lick their fur afterwards. If a HAB is present, keep your pets away from the water. If exposed to cyanobacterial toxins, animals can experience vomiting, diarrhea, weakness, difficulty breathing, seizures, or even death. Since bloom conditions can change rapidly and may move around the reservoir, DWR recommends that the public obey posted signs and stay away from the algae. Under a danger advisory, avoid eating fish or anything else that you catch in the affected water, and never use reservoir water for drinking or cooking. In waterways that are part of the State Water Project, the Department of Water Resources regularly tests for harmful algae contamination. When the lab tests are positive, signs are posted at the waterway and also online to warn people about the dangers of entering the water. Testing of the water continues until the lab results show that the water is below the health advisory level for 2 full weeks. Only then are the signs removed and the water considered safe. For many Californians, the best part of summer is spending time on the water with family and friends. And when you think about staying safe on the water, make sure you also consider what's in the water. Pay attention to posted signs. Look for characteristics of harmful algal blooms and keep your loved ones safe and healthy.
That worked, okay. So I wanted to show that, that's the current California Department of Water Resources video that they put out, which just to underscore, there's opportunities for our students to find addressing these problems. And this is a growing issue and is likely to grow with climate change and increasing temperatures. Let's see. So the other piece of it too is that nitrogen use actually also contributes to air pollution, not just water pollution. And there's some surprising kind of pathways for that. But one of it is when we overload our soils with nitrogen, there's reactions with bacteria and other, microorganisms. We know like a gram or a teaspoon of soil can have billions of bacteria. And emitted from the soil can be things like nitrogen oxides, ammonium, and nitrous oxide as well. Ammonium also can be administered from animal operations. So in the Central Valley, like in Tulare County, where we have, more cows than people, we have a lot of emissions from animal operations as well, not just soil. So when we put that stuff into the air, we get emissions, things like nitrogen dioxide, which is an EPA criteria air pollutant and affects respiratory health. There's also some complex atmospheric chemical transformations that take place when we have nitrogen oxide compounds like NO2 that comes into the air, and then it reacts with VOCs or volatile organic chemicals. So that's things like stuff emitted by gasoline, incomplete combustion of diesel. When we burn stuff, we put lots of VOCs in the air, in addition to particles and other bad stuff. There's also a certain amount of VOCs that are emitted by plants, like terpenes. Back in my youth, we had a president named Ronald Reagan who blamed trees for air pollution. And what he was referring to was that some of the VOCs in the air comes from like pine trees that smell of terpene. Those are VOCs, but most of the VOCs we have in our air comes from human sources, like especially traffic, fuel combustion. So it reacts with nitrogen oxide compounds when you add sunlight, and then you get ozone. And that's why in the summer, when it's the days are longer, there's more sunlight and also hot, we get ozone warnings, especially in the Central Valley. Also, Denver, the eastern front on the Colorado Rockies, often has really bad ozone. So, surprisingly, when we're applying something that's really not, you don't think of as an air contaminant to the soil, you're actually contributing to air pollution. There's also some of these chemical reactions can result in secondary reactions that actually create particulate matter as well, or drops of liquid. So there's a lot of impacts on air quality as well, not just the environment. And then this particular emission too, nitrous oxide, is actually a greenhouse gas. It's actually more potent than CO2. Not as much of it is going into the air as CO2 that we put in from fossil fuel combustion, but it sticks around in the atmosphere a long time. And of course, we have this trend of increasing global temperatures. And a piece of that is the nitrogen, the millions of tons of nitrogen we're using in agriculture. So now we kind of talked about the ecosystem level stuff and a little bit the individual level impacts, like from the harmful algal blooms. But let's kind of drill down a little bit more. And this is just kind of an interesting case study. This is a number of years ago from the Central Valley. And I want to thank Mark Miller and the UC San Francisco PACU, Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit, that put this together. If you remember when we talked about early on, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, we talked about vulnerability and how kids are more vulnerable to toxic substances for a number of reasons. One, because they get exposed more compared to an adult, and they're also not able to metabolize and get bad stuff out of their body compared to adults. And this is a case study where there was a female infant. It was breastfed, but was getting supplemented with formula. And at a follow-up visit, when the child was a month old, they noticed acrocyanosis, or kind of a blue color. And then 2 months later, the pharmacist made the same comment. So there's some evidence going on, but they didn't really understand what was happening. And then as the baby was getting fed more formula, made with well water, and this is where we often have problems in agricultural areas where private wells that are not under municipal authority are not as monitored. And the child started developing serious diarrhea and was rushed to a doctor, was turning blue and cyanotic, and the blood was not normal red blood, and the child actually died. And the well water was at 150 milligrams of nitrate per liter of water. So just to give some perspective here, the current standard, which was recently reduced for EPA, is less than 10 milligrams per liter. So it was 15 times higher than the current standard. I think this is an interesting thing to consider too when we talk about ratios. We talked a little bit about this before, but so we have basically a safety margin. In this case, there was only a safety margin of 15 between a lethal dose and a non-lethal and an acceptable dose. Sometimes we like bigger safety margins, but right now the standard is 10. Just to give a sense, we talked about, again, the baby had more exposure. Whoops. There we go. We looked at that previous picture where the young child had more red on their body, the little triangle, they had more exposure relative to the adult. Well, in this case, that's exactly what was going on. The child had a single food source. So it was getting way more nitrate than say an adult would have, because you're not, your main source of life is not drinking formula, and they're also taking lots of fluid. So they're getting much higher exposures. And then there is a number of kind of biological factors where we have in the stomach a pH and bacteria that are more likely to convert nitrate to something we call nitrites, which is a reduced form of nitrate. And these are kind of bugaboos. And then they can react with some of the forms of hemoglobin that are more dominant in young children, and then for methemoglobin. And then this kid had methemoglobinemia, which is where the nitrogen compounds are binding with your hemoglobin and preventing oxygenation. So there's not normal delivery of oxygen to the cells. And that's what killed this child. So again, there's the larger ecosystem impacts of nitrogen in agriculture, and then there's the really individual level. Again, I mentioned that nitrate gets converted in vivo in the kid's stomach, but to some extent in ourselves too, to what we call N-nitroso compounds, which are carcinogenic. And there's some epidemiological evidence that nitrate in drinking water, when it's elevated, is associated with a number of cancers. Just to provide some perspective, again, this is something that's a nutrient. It's essential for plant growth. But we concentrate it in agriculture. And if we're thinking about sustainability going forward, we need to find ways to perhaps use it more efficiently and less impactfully. So just to tie this together a little bit, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and it's worth checking out if you're not, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which kind of are a set of recommendation and goals to improve health in the environment. And there's a number of categories, and there's 5 in particular that are really impacted by agriculture and nitrogen use. This is a case study. We've talked about health, good health and well-being, clean water. It's definitely important. We see that nitrate gets in our water and makes it unhealthy. Climate action, it has impact on climate change, life on land, and life below water. We've seen how nitrogen runoff and other nutrient runoff as well can impact water quality and create harmful chemicals through toxins, through algae, and also impact life on land in terms of, potentially over fertilizing and creating vulnerability in over fertilizing natural environments. But we have this direct link though with toxins and things like that impacting land animals, including humans, because of these exposures. So this one issue really ties with a lot of the sustainability goals. And ideally, we want to have, there's kind of a number of analyses that suggest we need to have the amount of nitrogen that we're using in agriculture if we want to perhaps mitigate how far we cross that boundary, and maybe we can even pull it back a little bit more. There's some interesting work going on. Some of this is very local. So for your students, I think this could be a case study. Maybe you can even get the ag commissioner or people from the Water Quality Control Board to speak in your classes. One of the key things that are going on locally is called Ag Order 4.0, which is from the Central Coast Water Quality Control Board. And the goal of this is to, it's at specific targets for nitrogen use per acre of land, and tries to encourage less use of synthetic nitrogen. And by synthetic, I mean the Haber-Bosch chemical salt version of nitrogen versus natural sources like compost or the use of cover crops like legumes, fava beans, things like that can actually make a huge difference. They want to reduce the use of what we call fertigation, which is when, sometimes you see the sprinklers going, but there's often nitrogen salts and in that water to fertilize the fields. And that, if you use too much, it can go right into the environment. Brenda and I, when we first started this project with Chamacos, we were in Chular and we saw water spilling off a field and running through the storm drains of the town. And a lot of that was really an example of over irrigation. This was the summer, and there was just irrigation water spilling off the field and probably full of nitrogen. Again, more use of compost. And another use of cover crops too is to plant cover crops to suck up free nitrogen in the soil. And then they can be plowed in later and re-releasing it. But that way can be less soluble nitrogen in the soil, especially when the rainy season starts. So more solutions to pollution. And really kind of the message here is we need better fertilizer efficiency, and potentially there's other ways to recover nitrogen from agriculture. Again, I mentioned more natural nitrogen from legumes. Also, though, we have an incredible amount of nutrients that we just throw away in animal operations by throwing away waste and manure and things like that. And by throw away, I mean we have operations where some of it does get composted, but I can see this in the valley where, in the winter, there's these huge rainstorms and there's just lots of stuff just leaching out of those operations. There's also some proposals, and this has been interesting and controversial. You can take some of that urine and waste from animals and extract the nitrogen from there and potentially use that in agriculture as an alternative to synthesizing more nitrogen through the Haber-Bosch process. So that's essentially kind of being more efficient in how we manufacture and use nitrogen and try to cycle it rather than, essentially throwing it away. And again, when we apply to a field, we're only benefiting from about 50% of it. If we eat less meat or other crop-heavy plants, we think of meat as, you don't feed nitrogen to a cow, but you do feed it to all the soybeans and corn that are feeding that cow. So shifts in diet could have a big impact. And, again, this idea of wastewater treatment, there may be ways to reduce nitrogen more efficiently from wastewater and to be able to use it in other contexts. So I think we're about done here. But again, the idea here was to take the big picture, from a planet and planetary boundaries, and then zero in on one of these that's really impacted by agriculture. And I think that provides kind of a model and framework that I think hopefully, there's a lot of your students will be interested in, and it's really local. And there's also, like I said, there's job opportunities and really ways people can do stuff, and that can have a big impact.
We wanted to make sure there would be time to ask questions of Asa, but also for you to go back to your planetary boundary model. The thinking here was that this would be something you could do fairly easily with students. Amir is putting together a digital version of this too. So if, the construction paper coloring was wrangling too much, but the idea was that we wanted a physical model that students could manipulate, where you could literally draw a boundary around the earth and then have some of those conversations about, are we within the boundary or exceeding the boundary? Or, right, what might be solutions we could do to reduce, say, for example, in this case, the nitrogen use. So questions for Asa?
In the past, I've heard that there were different nitrate levels allowed in drinking water wells in areas that were agricultural. Throughout the state that say Salinas would allow higher levels of nitrates than cities that were not in the agricultural area, but has that been normalized where it's the same limit to how many nitrates are allowed in?
I don't think, I mean, the EPA standard should be uniform. I know that we once toured wells a little bit with somebody here, and there was a well in Salinas that was shut down. There was another one that was high, and they blended the water with water from another well to bring it down below the standard. But that was like 23 or 24 years ago. And at that point, I think the standard was 50, and now it's 10. So that would be a good question, like how are they dealing with compliance? And then, like I said, the biggest problems have been with private, small, once you get below 25 connections and it's on if it's on a private development, then the regulatory oversight is much less. And if you Google, there's a program called the OEHA, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, started something called the Human Right to Water Project about 5 or 8 years ago. And they have a map of all violations and things like that around the state. Maybe we can send a link out on that. It's pretty interesting.
I think OEHA is already on our Padlet, but we can do a specific link to the right to water.
Yeah. California in many ways is doing really progressive work. I think OEHA and some of the other agencies, Cali EPA in general is, it's been light years ahead of, say, US EPA.
David Holland at Monterey Bay Analytical Services, they do all of the municipal well testing for Monterey County, and they have been so busy because of Ag Order 4.0. The regulation increase is significant, and so I think he said it was something like 400
Wow.
wells that they've tested within our county. So a huge number.
Is that data publicly available?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think that it has to be reported to the state water board, but if it's on private land, I don't know what the reporting requirement is. I think the way Ag Order 4.0 is written is that there's this gradient period of like by 2025, they have to start reporting certain data, and then by 2030, they have to report additional data. So I think we're still in the people are making changes, but I don't know if that data is publicly available yet, but I'll ask him. That would be super cool.
Yeah, I know some people had, used to just go by the norm, like dilution is the solution to pollution. And I think in the 70s and 80s especially,
Right.
I talked to a toxicologist in New Zealand, but they could probably just get rid of all that stuff in the vast ocean currents, and that was just there. Some places it works better, maybe
Right.
just to push it out in the ocean or whatever, I don't know.
Right.
But how do you see, what would you see it transitioning into more of a enlightened way to get rid of all these heavy pollutants?
I mean, solution is the solution to pollution is kind of that's a slogan that's been around for a while.
Yeah.
And it is in a way. I mean, when you look at our planetary boundaries, kind of like in a way, we're saying that we've exceeded that capacity. And we can't keep adding carbon dioxide and expect that it's going to get absorbed into the ocean or into existing biosphere without having an impact. So we've gone beyond where, if you burn 1 ton of coal, no big deal. But if you burn millions and millions of tons every year, it's a big deal. So, I think that's where we need this idea of a circular economy, where we, reuse materials, and that we, especially like nutrients, thinking about it in terms of nitrogen, also other kinds of materials. Recycling is essentially an idea of the circular economy. When you buy a product, there should be built into it the cost of reusing it or recycling it, so kind of an end game for it. So there's a lot of work moving in that direction. And we'll see where we are in 50 years. Well, I won't, but yeah, hopefully.
I just had kind of a comment too, that there's kind of a lot of good news out on the agricultural front too. My husband sells fertilizer, and so I have a unique perspective on this. I have seen the change in the way that fertilizer is applied over the last 30 years. When he first started out, it was farmers just, they had a standard of this is how much we put on.
Right.
And now they go out and before any fertilizer is applied, they do soil samples, they test the nitrogen and other nutrient levels. They calculate the plant requirements for the crop that's being put in. And then they apply the amount of, his job is to mix the chemicals in the correct proportion to be applied to the right amount so that they don't have excess. But we're still dealing with a lot of practices that happened over the last 30 years. I teach in St. Lucas and we haven't had potable water in 10 years.
Yeah.
And so
yeah.
it's.
And I think that's part of like,
see.
how is the Ag Order 4.0 gonna move that forward? And on the ag industry side, I remember meeting with the ag folks once and they said, we'll follow the rules, and if the rules change, we'll follow the new rules.
Mhm.
And I think there's got to be a dynamic process to set those rules. Another technology, if you guys want to go into computer science, using satellite data and information to like track plant nutrition status in different parts of the field. And then you could, even apply nutrients or in some cases pesticides, target it to a certain area rather than blanketing the whole field.
Absolutely.
with
do
different-
that now.
So those are the kinds of things that I think that more of has to happen.
I think one of the coolest things, the nitrate test strips that we did in December at Alba are an example of things that I've seen farmers literally carry and then test their soil as they're doing another cycle in terms of growing. But it's been super interesting to see the undergraduate students in the agricultural crop and soil science program here are looking at kind of the tailoring of the nutrients that you described, where it's like, okay, I want to grow strawberries and I know that they need these macronutrients and these micronutrients. And so it's actually this really beautiful chemistry of like, how can we optimize the nutrients that plants need for growth? And so I feel like almost kind of like medicine has become personalized. We're seeing this really cool shift of not personalizing, but planticizing the nutrients for growth cycles. And I feel like that's such a cool career for a student because, right, you're integrating what you know about biology and what you know about chemistry. And like, it's a management space that probably changes dynamically too in response to climate change and other spaces. So I know of students who are getting jobs now with a bachelor's degree that are earning, I think, probably double my salary to be able to do that management because it's so critical for growers.
Right.
So I feel like it's a really cool career space.
I think the word some people are using now is hyper local.
Yeah, that's a great way.
I think that applies both to neighborhoods, health, and also plant health.
I'm just curious, so I took a group of students to the wastewater treatment plant in Marina. And one of the big, exciting things was to drink the super treated water, like, I think it was reverse osmosis in the end, but it was wastewater that had been treated multiple times. They have a faucet, they hand out paper cups, and then all the students are going and drinking this wastewater water. And initially, I was not gonna do it. For exactly what you said about like, oh, well, when they come up with new regulations, then we'll test for them. And, I think we've just added like PFOAs, or we're about to, styrene, arsenic. I'm like, I don't know what's in there. Yeah, fine. It's good for what we're testing for now, but we're not testing for everything now. I did end up taking a sip of it. But anyway, I'm just curious what.
Yeah, well, I think you raised an important point about, the ick factor in that case. And it's true, what we're not testing, we don't know if it's there or not. And the standards that are being proposed for PFAS are just, they're in the part per trillion range, which is like infinitesimally small. But I mean, there certainly is monitoring that's going on. And, I think it's, if we talk about the idea of continuous improvement, the technology gets better and our awareness also increases about what to be concerned about. And given how precious water is and, when we have a drought, how, problematic it is, it is important to recycle it. But I understand that. And, one thing, and I think your point is really important, is that, and I think I'll maybe add some more of that to this talk, is that we don't want to be doom and gloom. The idea is to kind of talk about, we have these immense problems, but like, what are the solutions that we can, train our people and to learn and as that generation goes forward, how can we try to solve something?
Asa, could you talk a little bit about the work you do with the National Organic Standards Board? Because I feel like this question of like, what do we test for, really is growing and changing. Like, they test now for things that we would not have even known were present in the water. Would you be willing to share just a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, I should say was, because I got off the board a couple of years ago. It was a 5-year appointment. So the National Organic Standards Board is kind of like the Supreme Court for organic standards in the US. And it's, I mean, a lot of the work is, well, with organic, basically, if something's natural, it's allowed unless it's prohibited. So, for example, lead and arsenic have been used as pesticides, but they're obviously prohibited in organic. So they're natural, but they've been prohibited. And then the other piece is, if something is synthetic, it's banned unless it's allowed. So that means that things like, there's some soaps that are used, for example, for to kill aphids. And soap is considered synthetic, but it's on the list because, based on the standards, it's not too impactful to the environment. There's also the things like chlorine sanitizers and stuff like that, which those are powerful pesticides. They're required for compliance with the FSMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, and, in processing and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things on the list that, are also powerful materials, and alternatives to those actually are a common discussion. So on the organic side, you can't use synthetic fertilizers like synthetic nitrogen or certain sorts of phosphorus and stuff like that. And the overall goal is to really promote, the idea of a circular production system. And I mean, that's, I think, kind of the essence of organic. And then in terms of testing those, say for contaminants, there are testing requirements because we do have natural, there can be contamination from, conventional ag use, and also from, like, for example, almost everywhere we test for DDT, for example, in Salinas and house dust, we find DDT everywhere. And that's because it's left over from, when it used to be used in the United States. So there is testing for that too, and there are thresholds for what could be allowed in organic. But I think that when we talk about organic agriculture, again, the emphasis really is on using kind of minimally harmful and more natural products, and also cycling them, as opposed to the idea of applying an input and then harvesting your output, and then kind of ignoring what happens to that input after you've applied it.
Just want to add 2 points, Jennifer, to what your question is. And one is, we can only test for something that we have a way of testing it. And so there are many chemicals we can't test for. So that's one thing. The second
Or it's
thing is,
really expensive.
or it's really expensive. The other thing is Monterey One does not have pharmaceuticals. And so we are putting pharmaceuticals into our gray water, and that's getting better. I think I might have mentioned this, in studies in Israel that have shown that those pharmaceuticals get taken up by the root system into the leaves of the plant and are eaten by humans and excreted. So we can see that pharmaceuticals are coming out of people
that have been exposed to it. So we have a whole other realm of stuff that we're not testing for that's super important.
So we wanted to give time for you to talk with each other about how you would think about integrating planetary boundaries with students. And then we were hoping that you'd be willing to share out what your thoughts were in terms of where you think it fits and what might be effective ways to both center solutions for students and connect with careers. So maybe can we do 10 minutes at your tables, and then we'd love to hear each table share out. Does that sound good?
Are we curious about this?
Mhm. Here.
Was this sort of a background thing, or are we gonna go over specifics of it?
So the intention behind this activity was, as folks were coming in, to start the conversation about what you think about planetary boundaries. We think that whether it's a hands-on activity like this or a digital one, having students like make suggestions in terms of like, well, I think this is within a planetary boundary, or I think this might be outside the planetary boundary, is a really great space to start the conversation, because you could say, well, what do you think? And then as ESTA shared, you could actually say, well, for climate change, we're outside the planetary boundary. And then that's a great space to invite what would be solutions for how we could reduce our CO2 emissions.
You could also look at it within like your watershed too. We can look at, say, Monterey County and think about, are we within or without, you know, the capacity of this region for some of these as well, or are we over contributing geographically?
I think maybe my question was more, I'm not quite understanding. And I noticed, for example, Tom did things a little bit differently than me in the way he layered them. I put all the reds together, all the yellows together, thinking I could turn it.
You have
And-
freedom and flexibility.
But I was kind of wondering, couldn't you just do one red, one green, one yellow, and then you would, as you talk about each
Yeah.
one, you could just be like this,
Yep.
and this.
Yep, you would have the freedom to do that. So if we
But I
think
didn't know
about,
if I was missing something.
nope, you're not missing something. So
That's
The-
actually a great idea.
the
I love that.
planetary boundary that the Stockholm Resilience Center proposed is complex. It's all 9, and it actually shows gradients within those 9. But when you're talking about it with students, maybe it makes sense to just start with one. Like the biogeochemical flows is a great one to just start with and say, oh, what would it mean to be within green for our system? What would it mean to be yellow? What would it mean to be red? And you could then add more in as you're thinking about it. That's a great way to use and talk about the planetary boundary. The other one that we thought about was like, maybe, right, you could have students work in groups where each group could take one, that's 9 groups total, and then talk about, well, what would it mean to be in green or yellow or red? So I feel like there are several resources that you could share with students. And part of what we were thinking was it would be great for you all to talk about what might be ways to help students use planetary boundaries in a meaningful way.
I know this is a little off, but I was just wondering, so as we're talking about students, talking to the students as well. So I know that we, these are all like data-based boundaries, but when they say boundaries, are we indicating like based on previous mass extinction rates? Is this like, that's a really hard thing, right? So each mass extinction is like, we don't have that much data on some, but like, we don't know like what was the things that resulted in that mass extinction exactly? Like, was it just like excessive CO2, excessive like lack, particulates? Was it a change in, like, what was the like,
Yeah.
like, you know what I mean? So when they're calculating like boundaries exceeded, are they saying like to maintain our current like era right now with the
Yes.
environmental and with the biodiversity that's currently on the earth in 2024, like to maintain that same diversity equilibrium at this level, like,
Yeah.
so there's no change. So it's not talking about, I think that's, students don't get that either. It's like, it doesn't mean there's no
Yeah.
more life on earth. It
Yeah.
just means the life would be different.
I think they're
Right.
saying that this is kind of human caused disequilibrium.
Well,
this
yeah,
is-
I know it's human, but I meant,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think I said the wrong way. I know it's human caused, but I'm like, so when they say boundaries, when they're calculating that data and they're saying now we've exceeded it. I know it's human caused, but for the most part, it's human caused issues, right? It's artificial, but what I mean is when we're talking to students, when they're saying these boundaries and they say, where did these
Boundaries come from.
boundaries come from? Like, how do they know that this is a boundary and what did that mean? Like,
Well-
because they could be like, my kids, they just learned about the past years. They're like, there was 100 times more CO2 in the air, and there used to be giant animals and
Right,
way more
right,
plants,
right.
so,
Well, I think that
Yeah.
that's a great concept to address, and
yeah.
we can go back to the original papers and the people who proposed this. But it's also, when we look at disequilibrium, for example, we're seeing more frequent floods in East Africa. And we're seeing more, because of that, there's more frequent outbreaks of locusts. And because of that, there's probably more famine going on. And, that's a situation where there's probably human-caused disequilibrium that's resulting in more famine and also more migration and movement. There's a number of wars that are probably attributable to resource issues.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that you're right. I mean, there's always change going
Oh,
on.
no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean
Yeah.
that, I apologize. It's just like, we were talking to our students, these are boundaries for each. I'm saying like, how did they like come up with
What the boundary was.
what these boundaries are? Not like the data with the boundaries that the kids can get, and that's
Right.
easy, but I was just thinking about, like, I don't know exactly like, where did this?
To me, it seems like it's
It makes sense,
the
but where did
boundary
it come from?
for our species to be
Mhm.
able to continue
It makes
surviving.
sense, but I
on
mean,
this
where did,
planet.
oh, yeah,
Yeah.
I apologize.
Well,
I understand what
I
it
think
means,
that's a great
but where
question,
is it?
and we should go back and maybe,
Yeah.
I could probably teach a whole course in this, but
There's actually a
let's
super
go
cool
back
one.
to the
Yeah.
foundational articles, yeah.
Yeah,
I think that when I read through the original paper in 2009, what the group of scientists did was they aggregated multiple data sources. So they were looking at the amount of human population, and they were looking at the calculated or available amount, say, for example, of fresh water. And that was how they made a determination. We know this is the recommended amount of drinking water that
per
each
person.
human would need. This is the amount of available fresh water. And then out of that, there's the available amount of drinking water, and then making that determination. And then I think similarly for something like the nitrogen, that is a really interesting calculation. Again, a great job for a student, right? Calculating for countries, for continents, what is the current application of nitrogen? A really great example, totally pertinent to your question. There are a number of climate changes in Africa that are resulting in changes in the way they're applying fertilizer. They're applying much more fertilizer now than they did in 2015. So the 2009, 2015, and 2023 that ESTA showed for the planetary boundaries with changes, part of the reason why there's an increase in 2023 is because for something like biogeochemical flows, the continent of Africa is applying way more fertilizer now than they did in 2015 or in 2009. So some of it is like local changes, but then you think about the aggregation of those local changes. And I feel like that's a really cool thing for students to think about. It's a lot of data sources that you have to integrate to just do one boundary in terms of one of the planetary boundaries. So it's a lot of data wrangling. And I think maybe what's fair too is it's also making assumptions. And you can evaluate whether or not that assumption is reasonable, which is maybe another great conversation to have.
One more quick, interesting question. I like that quote, like limiting nutrients, keep things from reaching maximum productivity, how we don't have something that can't grow. I was wondering if a more helpful way to pitch this to students would just be sort of transforming it the other way and kind of into what about toxins building up keep things from reaching maximum productivity too.
Ooh, that's a great way of framing it.
Yeah, so that way we're because toxins are gonna build up and we're gonna suffer from that. And that is gonna be a boundary. But it's gonna happen. It already is happening,
Right,
but it's the reality.
right.
And we're just not gonna be able to be productive as that happens.
Well, and equilibrium goes in both directions. My colleague, Professor Arlene Hoffa is here. She does this amazing work looking at carbon mitigation in soil and ways in which growers can change. I don't know, Arlene, would you be willing to share just a little bit?
Well, actually, we're more worried about the nitrogen.
Mhm.
So, nitrous oxide is a gas that's produced when there's too much fertilizer and not enough carbon. And it's 300 times more potent at closing the window for greenhouse gas, heating. So 1 mole of nitrous oxide is like 300 moles of carbon dioxide. And so I'm working with the local growers to try to reduce their fertilizer inputs, because that's a clear way to reduce climate change locally. But the problem is, we just harvested a crop yesterday. I have a broken arm and a broken leg. But, when we reduce the nitrogen to what the water board wants, so the Ag Order 4.0 is trying to reduce nitrate pollution in our wells, so people in the county don't get methemoglobin and blue baby syndrome. The lettuce was not marketable. So there's this fine line between sustainability of a business to keep the crop to go to market with this, oh, I want to protect the environment from either nitrate pollution in the water and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. And I don't know if any of you teach physics, but it has to do with like black body radiation and that little window. It makes the window dirty. So it's better at closing the window than carbon dioxide, and that's why it's a good greenhouse gas. But there's a lot of money right now behind trying to reduce nitrogen inputs. Find the sweet spot.
The tricky bit.
Thank you.
As far as you know, are there different standards for nitrates and nitrates?
Yeah, well, it's just the nitrogen inputs altogether, and the water board is saying like if you add compost, which has more carbon, that you get sort of like free inputs. And so that's kind of what we're looking at. Like if you add enough carbon, can you keep the nitrogen there?
No, I was referring to, whose question was?
I was late, I'm sorry.
That's okay, there was a question about whether there would be different standards, different water standards in different communities. And as far as I know, it's a state standard.
It's a local water board, I think, right? It's a state water board, but we have a local authority here for our crops. Because our crops would be different than, let's say, the forests. of
No, I
northern
think Brenda's
California.
asking about drinking water.
Drinking water.
Well, the drinking water standards are set, yeah.
Yeah.
So EPA,
They're federal, not state,
correct,
And they're uniform.
and they're uniform.
I believe so.
Yeah.
I haven't
That's what I
worked with
would think.
EPA for
Yeah.
a long time.
That's what I would think.
But, go ahead.